Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something fascinating. 7th century BCE Urartian bronze weaponry found at AYANIS over in Turkey.
That's right. And specifically, we're trying to figure out where the copper in that bronze actually came from.
Yeah, and the answer seems, well, pretty surprising. We're seeing connections potentially reaching all the way to Cyprus.
Exactly. Think of it less like looking at museum pieces and more like forensic metallurgy. We're examining the elemental makeup, the isotopic signatures, the fingerprints left in the metal.
And the goal for you, the listener, is to get a sense of just how connected the Urartian state was. How far did they reach to get materials for these, elite items?
The source material for this is an analysis of tin bronze weapons, mostly quiver fragments, plus a couple of helmets.
All found at AYANIS,
Yeah.
and they date specifically to the reign of King Urartu II. That's about 685 to 653 BCE.
And AYANIS is really key here. It was an important fortress built quite late in the Urartian period by Urartu II, right there near Lake Van.
What makes it so useful for this study is the sheer amount of really high-quality copper alloy stuff found there.
Especially in the temple area. Loads of it.
Okay, so when thinking about how a state like Urartu got its hands on resources, you usually think, well, maybe local mines.
Right. That's one possibility. Local production.
Or maybe something more complex, long-distance trade. Maybe tribute or diplomatic gifts, especially for the really fancy stuff.
Exactly. That's the question we're trying to unravel. Was it local, or were they plugged into wider networks?
So just to set the scene a bit more, the Urartian state, 9th to 7th centuries BCE, centered around Lake Van.
Yeah, it's one of those ancient Near Eastern powers that maybe doesn't get as much attention as, say, Assyria or Babylon, but it was a significant regional player, expanded quite a bit.
And understanding how they interacted over long distances, which this study gets at, is really crucial to understanding their power and strategy.
Precisely. AYANIS itself, founded by Urartu II, probably around 673 or 672 BCE, lasting until maybe 653 BCE. Its location on the eastern shore of Lake Van wasn't random.
And finding all those high-quality copper alloy objects, particularly in the temple, it just shouts importance.
It really does. And the specific focus here is on weaponry helmets, shields, quivers, arrowheads, classic Urartian metalwork.
But the interesting thing is, we actually don't know that much about how they made this stuff, or, crucially, where they got the raw materials.
Exactly. Which brings us to the analysis itself. The researchers used two main techniques. First, elemental analysis.
Okay, what does that involve?
They used ICP-OES and ICP-MS. Think of them as super precise ways to measure exactly what elements are in the metal and in what amounts. So copper, tin, obviously, but also tiny amounts of things like arsenic, lead, iron, zinc.
Gotcha. And they analyzed 19 objects this way, mostly those quiver fragments and the two helmets.
That's the set, yes. And you have to remember, these things are ancient. They're often broken, corroded.
So cleaning them properly first would be vital.
Absolutely, you need a clean sample. Then the second technique was lead isotope ratio analysis using TIMS.
Lead isotopes, that's the fingerprinting part you mentioned.
Exactly that. Different copper ore deposits around the world formed at different times, geologically speaking, and they picked up slightly different ratios of lead isotopes, like lead 206, 207, 208, relative to lead 204.
And those ratios don't really change when the ore is smelted and made into bronze?
Largely, no. They get passed along into the final object. So if you have a good database of isotope ratios for known ore deposits, you can potentially match the artifact's signature back to a source region, or at least rule sources out.
Okay, fascinating. So let's start with the first technique. What did the elemental analysis show about the composition? What were these weapons actually made of?
Well, no huge surprises initially. Most were tin bronzes, as expected for the period and type of object.
But was the recipe consistent?
Not entirely. There was quite a bit of variation, actually. Copper content ranged from about 62 up to nearly 80% by weight. And the tin varied, too, from just over 1% up to almost 9%.
That lower end, around 1% tin. That's quite low for bronze, isn't it? What's the thinking there?
Yeah, two samples were below 2% tin. The researchers suggested maybe it points to recycling, melting down older bronze where maybe some tin was lost or depleted.
Or maybe deliberately mixing in fresh copper.
That's the other possibility, adding purer copper to bronze scrap or residues. They noted similar low tin finds at another Urartian site, Burmajisit, so it might be a feature of their metalworking practices sometimes.
Interesting. What about the other elements, the trace stuff? Arsenic, lead.
Generally, the copper seems pretty pure. Low levels of arsenic, lead, iron, zinc, mostly under 1%.
Okay.
They did caution that the iron levels might be a bit high just from corrosion being buried for millennia, but one sample did have notably higher lead, which they think probably came directly from the original ore itself.
Right, so we know what it is. Now, the big question. Where did the copper come from? What did the lead isotopes reveal?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. The isotope data clearly showed that the copper wasn't all from one place. They identified at least 3 distinct groups based on the lead isotope ratios.
3 groups.
Well, minimum 3. There were 3 samples that stood out with more radiogenic lead, a different isotopic signature. And one outlier had a signature suggesting geologically older lead.
So those 4 are probably from different sources entirely.
Very likely different sources, yes. Not one single mine for all of them. And it's always tricky because mixing metals, like through recycling, can complicate the lead signature too. The lead source isn't always the same as the primary copper source if things got mixed.
Understood. What about the main bulk, the other 15 or 16 samples?
Right. The remaining 16 actually formed a relatively tight cluster on the isotope plots. But even within that cluster, when they cross-referenced with the minor element compositions.
Combining both sets of data.
Exactly. They could see potential subgroups. For example, a couple of objects were similar in nickel and antimony, but different in arsenic and sulfur. Another pair were similar in zinc and antimony. One sample, HYZ, seemed a bit different from the others in the cluster.
So nuances even within the main group.
Yes. And then a final little subgroup of 4 objects had slightly higher lead isotope ratios than the core cluster. It suggests a complex picture, maybe slightly different ore bodies within the same region, or perhaps mixing of materials.
Does this complex picture give any more clues about recycling?
It's hard to prove recycling definitively just from this, but the researchers acknowledge it's definitely a possibility, especially thinking back to those couple of low-tin samples. It's a factor you have to keep in mind.
Okay, multiple sources, complex picture. Can we actually pin any of these isotopic signatures to specific locations on a map?
That's the ultimate goal, but also the biggest challenge. You need a really comprehensive database of known ore deposits and their isotope signatures from all the potential regions: Anatolia, the Caucasus, Iran.
And we don't quite have that complete picture yet.
Not completely, no. So it's often easier to say where the copper didn't come from rather than pinpointing the exact mine. It's about eliminating possibilities.
Okay, so what could they rule out based on the AYANIS data?
This was a key finding. The AYANIS samples did not match the isotopic signatures of the major, well-known copper sources right there in eastern Anatolia, like Urgani Maiden or Kiban.
Really? The local source?
Yeah. Those sources tend to have more radiogenic lead signatures than what they found in most of the AYANIS artifacts, so the simplest explanation that they just used copper from down the road seems unlikely for these particular objects.
Wow, okay, so if not local, where else did the isotopes point? Any matches or potential matches?
There were some possibilities. One of the outliers, GUK, showed some consistency with certain Anatolian ores from Gulkuk. Another outlier, GAC, looked potentially consistent with sources in the Caucasus or the Eastern Pontiades region along the Black Sea coast.
Okay, so Anatolia and Caucasus still in the mix.
Yes, and a couple more from the main cluster, GCC and HCM, also align reasonably well with Caucasus and Eastern Pontide sources. Sample HYZ, the slightly divergent one in the main cluster, actually showed its best consistency with sources way down in the central Taurus Mountains, places like Bulgarda.
Taurus Mountains. That's southern Turkey. Still quite a distance. Any other possibilities? Further afield?
Well, this is the really surprising part. 2 samples, GCC and FLT, actually showed some consistency with ores from Oman.
Oman, wow.
But the most striking finding, the one that really stood out, involved the biggest group, 15 out of the 19 samples.
15, the vast majority.
Yes. Showed remarkable consistency with known Cypriot copper ores, places like Limni, Kalvassos, Limassol, and Cyprus.
Cyprus, okay, that is long distance.
It really is. And it wasn't just the lead isotopes. The elemental composition, things like the arsenic and nickel levels, also compared well with what we know about Cypriot copper from that era, for instance, from the copper ingots found on the Uluburun shipwreck. Those are thought to represent relatively unrefined Cypriot copper.
So multiple lines of evidence pointing towards Cyprus for a lot of this material.
Pretty strongly, yes. They do note some slight differences in one specific isotope ratio, 208 PbP, 206 Pb for some Cypriot ores, but overall the correlation was very compelling.
Okay, let's unpack that. Finding such a strong link to Cypriot copper. What does that imply about Urartu in the 7th century BCE?
Well, it implies they had a pretty extensive supply network, doesn't it? It points strongly towards significant long-distance interaction. It means Urartu wasn't just operating in its own little corner. It was plugged into the wider Near Eastern and Mediterranean economy, at least for certain goods.
And these weren't just any goods. These were elite weapons, status symbols.
Exactly. Found in an elite context, the fortress temple. It underscores how important tin bronze was for projecting power and status, and acquiring the raw materials, potentially from far away, was part of that projection. It really highlights the interconnectedness of these Iron Age societies.
How would Cypriot copper even get to landlocked Urartu around Lake Van? Do we have evidence for trade routes like that?
That's a good question. We do have some clues. Assyrian reliefs, for instance, show what look like oxide ingots, a shape often associated with Cypriot copper, being brought as tribute to Assyrian kings like Shalmaneser III and Ashurnasirpal II.
So Assyria might have been involved, maybe as an intermediary, or controlling the trade.
Possibly. There's been debate. Did the Assyrians make those ingots themselves, or were they importing them from Cyprus? The evidence seems increasingly to favor Cypriot export during the Iron Age.
And Urartu's relationship with Assyria was complex, often hostile.
Very complex, often hostile, yes. But Urartu also had its own sphere of influence. The nature of their foreign relations is debated too. Was it mainly based on coercion, demanding tribute and taxes, as some Urartian texts suggest?
Or was there more reciprocal trade going on?
It's hard to say definitively. We find some Urartian-style artifacts, like cauldron attachments, scattered around the Mediterranean, but not in huge numbers compared to, say, Phoenician goods.
So if there was trade, maybe it wasn't direct Urartian merchants sailing to Cyprus.
Probably not direct sea voyages, no. It likely involved intermediaries, maybe through coastal hubs like Almina or Tarsus in the Levant Cilicia, or perhaps Trabzon on the Black Sea, or even overland routes potentially involving places like Gordian in central Anatolia.
So pulling this all together, the analysis suggests Urartu wasn't just relying on one source for its copper.
Definitely not. The picture emerging is one of multiple sources. They were likely using resources from Anatolia, maybe the Caucasus, but also, significantly, engaging in exchange, whether trade, tribute, or something else, to acquire copper from as far away as Cyprus.
So wrapping up this deep dive on the AYANIS bronzes, the big takeaway is that the copper used for this elite Urartian weaponry wasn't just local. A really significant portion seems to trace back quite convincingly to Cyprus.
That's the main headline, yes. It challenges any simple assumption about Urartu just using nearby resources, especially for these high-status items. It highlights a much more complex and far-reaching supply network than we might have expected.
And like all good research, it opens up more questions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. For instance, it would be great to see similar analyses done on bronzes from earlier Urartian sites. Does this apparent access to Mediterranean copper, like from Cyprus, correlate with periods when Urartu historically controlled areas further west, like around Malatya, which might have facilitated that connection?
That makes sense. And what about definitively confirming or ruling out those local sources near Lake Van?
That's crucial. We really need more isotopic work on the actual copper deposits in the Lake Van region itself, places like Shirvan, Harap, Mud and Co. Without characterizing those local ores properly, we can't be 100% certain about their contribution or lack thereof.
It's been a really fascinating journey tracing this metal. It leaves you with a final thought, perhaps. If the Urartian elite were focused more on controlling the production of these bronze objects, using copper potentially sourced by others from far afield, rather than controlling the mines themselves, what does that imply about how their power worked? About their economic and political influence versus direct resource control? And you have to wonder, what other materials, what other goods might have traveled along these same long-distance routes, carrying ideas and technologies with them?
Indeed, lots to think about. The threads connecting the ancient world were often longer and more complex than we imagine.